A serious severe weather outbreak is coming tomorrow evening, and over 50 million Americans are in risk zones across Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, and some surrounding areas. The Storm Prediction Center has issued an aggressive, moderate 4 out of 5 risk on the day 2 outlook. So if you're in any of these areas, you're going to need to pay attention to today's forecast. This event has all the makings of a major severe weather episode, including rich moisture at the surface, powerful winds aloft, a strong forcing mechanism, and factors that will help storms stay isolated, lasting for hours and gaining strength. This could be the biggest event in 2026 so far, with the risk for very large hail, hurricane force winds, and intense tornadoes all expected by the Storm Prediction Center. So let's get right into everything that you need to know in today's forecast. I did want to take a quick look at what's going on today around the country. There is a 1 out of 5 marginal risk for various portions, including the Gulf Coast, areas in the Midwest, and in the Northern Plains. Looking at our tornado outlook for today, we do have a risk along the Gulf Coast. That's a 2% region. I'm not expecting anything crazy, but it is to do with that tropical disturbance. It's going to bring a lot of rainfall to the Gulf Coast as well. So flooding is definitely a major concern in that area. And in the same breath, we do have another 2% region in Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. The wind risk for today does include the Gulf Coast and a couple of different portions in the middle of the country, including the northern plains as well. And finally, our hail outlook for today does actually include Iowa, this region here, for some stronger storms that may develop, as well as the northern plains and a couple of these other areas that we've already mentioned throughout the middle of the country. Tomorrow's severe weather is definitely the most concerning, with an outbreak expected in the Midwest, but I quickly wanted to point out the wind and flooding risk that we have along the Gulf Coast associated with that tropical disturbance. So if you're along the Gulf Coast, definitely stay paying attention to that. But our concern is going to be in the Midwest for this forecast. Looking at our more significant area of concern, though, we do have this marginal risk that extends all the way from the Twin Cities through Wichita, Kansas, and through the Ohio Valley. But our main concern is going to be in Illinois and Indiana, where you see that shaded in red area. That is your moderate 4 out of 5 risk issued by the Storm Prediction Center, where our greatest concern for significant tornadoes is going to be. We do have this 2% region, like I said, stretching all the way from the Twin Cities through Wichita and even into the Ohio Valley through Toledo and Columbus, Ohio. But our main concern is where you're going to see that SIG-2, those diagonal lines that are showing up near Springfield, Peoria, Champaign, and Lafayette throughout portions of Illinois and Indiana. That's going to be our most significant concern for tornadoes, where we have a level 2 intensity. That's a SIG-2 intensity for strong tornadoes, as well as a 15% risk in that red shaded in circle that you see in the middle of the map. We also have a very widespread risk for wind damage encompassing that same area that I mentioned before through Wichita, Ohio, and the Twin Cities. And we have a SIG-1 risk for wind that stretches all the way from Kansas through Toledo, Ohio. So a very significant wind risk, especially if anything becomes linear. If it does become linear and we get a line of thunderstorms that are all connected instead of a bunch of discrete storms in a line, the shift from tornado damage to wind damage will be pretty significant. The wind risk will improve dramatically. And finally, looking at our hail risk, we do have a SIG-1 risk that is pretty widespread here in this red circle, where you see those diagonal lines that are going from bottom left to top right, essentially. But this is not the most significant hail producing event, but it is definitely possible that we get some very large hail, especially localized from Quincy, Peoria, and Davenport throughout Illinois, maybe northeastern Missouri, and parts of southeastern Iowa. We also do have a very large region of severe weather expected on Thursday, and that's going to include a slight risk, 2 out of 5 on the day 3 outlook for New York and all the way back through Tennessee and Kentucky. So that's definitely one to watch over the next couple of days, but we'll give another forecast video updating on that tomorrow and Thursday morning. And finally, for our outlooks, we are watching for a potential another round of severe weather in the central plains throughout Kansas and Nebraska and even Missouri and Iowa. That's going to be on Saturday the 20th, so 4 days from now. So we're going to watch that one closely. And again, we'll continue to provide updates in the coming days. Before we jump into the meteorology, I did want to show the timing, as that's a lot of times the most important thing for a lot of folks. As you can see, we do have this line of thunderstorms on Tuesday afternoon that's going to push through Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and eventually towards the southeast, towards Kentucky and Tennessee as we go forward in time here. More thunderstorms in the Ohio Valley and especially in the lower peninsula of Michigan, and even some more storms back in the northern plains and parts of Canada here throughout the afternoon. This is Tuesday by 5 p.m. And as we go into the overnight hours, a couple more thunderstorms could pop up in the quad state region of Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, and Kansas, and more storms in the northern plains and Midwest as well, and through the Ohio Valley. And you can see all this precipitation along the Gulf Coast and even portions of the East Coast as well. That'll bring the risk for some flooding throughout the day as well. And here we go early into Wednesday morning. This is by 7 a.m. You can see a little bit of the setup for Wednesday as we've got all of these thunderstorms here that could dissipate and set up some boundaries. So that's going to be something to watch. And again, more storms along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. That's going to bring the risk for some flooding and potentially some wind damage. And now that the HRRR is finished rendering, we can go ahead and continue to push through Wednesday morning. As you can see, this cluster of thunderstorms coming through Illinois, and that's going to set up a lot of these potential boundaries, and it's going to pose the risk for one of our fail modes, which is how far can it stop this warm front from propagating to the north. So if it can keep it further south and keep some of that instability and lift away from our favorable environment that's going to be throughout this region here, then that would be good in limiting our tornado risk. But the likelihood of that happening is definitely pretty slim. As we move through the afternoon hours here on Wednesday, you're going to see these storms begin to push off into the Ohio Valley. And now we're going to have initiation with our big line of thunderstorms that's going to be pushing towards the southeast, firing off around 4 p.m. And this is at 5 p.m. here on Wednesday as we get towards Kansas, Missouri, and central Illinois. And then a little bit later on by 7 p.m., you're going to see some of these storms starting to come into Indiana. And that is going to be where some of our most favorable environment is going to be for tornadoes. So this is something that we have to watch very, very closely throughout the next day to see how things are going to shape up. Eventually into the overnight hours, this is by 11 p.m., things are going to come a little bit more linear, and that's going to lower our tornado threat and increase our wind threat. But the threat for embedded tornadoes is still going to be there throughout the evening because this environment is so favorable and has so much spin available to it. So it's something that we have to watch very closely throughout the next day to see how models continue to shape up. All right, we are going to go step by step from the top down in the atmosphere. As you can see, this is up at the top levels of the atmosphere at 300 millibars. You can see this jet streak starting to come through. These very fast winds aloft are going to help with rising motion and divergence aloft at the tropopause. So basically, where the stratosphere and the troposphere align, there's a little barrier where there's a temperature inversion. And at that barrier, you'll get those faster winds aloft sometimes with the jet stream, and those winds, as they exit that region, the mass has to be replaced from below it. So you get rising motion associated with that. So this jet streak is going to aid in our rising motion and essentially our instability and our ability to get explosive growth in our thunderstorm development on Wednesday. Looking at our 500 millibar winds, our mid-level winds, these are also very indicative of divergence. You can see here on Wednesday, this is 7 p.m., just very, very fast winds at the mid-levels. It's something you don't really see that often this time of year. We have a very significant dip in our jet stream and a shortwave that's driving this whole event. And these mid-level winds are just pretty insane. You don't see this a lot this time of the year, like I said. This is a pretty rare type of scenario, but you can see, especially in Illinois and Indiana, some pretty insane mid-level support. And again, that's going to aid in our rising motion, which is what you need for that explosive thunderstorm growth. Another key factor is our 850 millibar wind. So this is where your low-level jet is going to be located. As you can see, going into Wednesday, we're going to have one of the more robust low-level jets that you'll ever see this time of year, going through Illinois, Indiana, and even stretching into Ohio and parts of Missouri, especially near St. Louis where I'm at. So this type of low-level support is really going to support your inflow for these thunderstorms. It's going to help them maintain clean air coming into it, good energy and moisture getting sucked into the storm so that these storms can continue to intensify and last for many hours. And now looking at our vorticity, this is at 850 millibars, so the low-level jet kind of region of our vorticity, which is just spin in the atmosphere. By 8 p.m., you can just see these large regions where there's tons of vorticity available, so storms that can fire off are going to have a much easier time rotating and getting going. Something else that's worth looking at is our precipitable water. So essentially, this is just in a vertical column of the atmosphere, how much water is there available for precipitation. You can see this is 7 p.m. during the middle of this potential outbreak. There's a lot. These values are very, very high, potentially getting over 2. By far, one of the most significant features of this event and its environment is going to be our spin and our shear in the atmosphere. I mean, you can see here, this is by 7 p.m., just unbelievably large values throughout the Ohio Valley and in Indiana. And so any storms that are able to take advantage of that environment, especially here in Indiana and southern Illinois, are going to be in a very, very favorable environment with a lot of shear and a lot of spin. So this is, again, your storm relative helicity. This is just how much spin can be ingested into the updraft potentially for any storms that take advantage of it. And in this area throughout southern central Illinois and portions of Indiana, there is a lot. So you're going to see those photographs that have that very big hook shape to them. It kind of looks like a fish hook. And that's going to be the type of environment that's very conducive for stronger tornadoes. And so again, I know the language is a little concerning, but this is for good reason with this type of setup. This is one of the more concerning setups that we've seen in the last year or so. Looking at our significant tornado parameter, this is where some of these ingredients are just going to overlap, and you can see just a large area where tornadoes are going to be possible, getting into very high values on the significant tornado parameter, upwards of potentially 8. And that's pretty crazy stuff. That is a very, very, very favorable environment for tornadoes. The threat is even going to linger into the later evening hours, especially in southwestern Indiana and southern Illinois, as these storms continue to push that direction. So a potential nocturnal threat with nighttime tornadoes as well. Looking at some of our surface features on Wednesday, you can see all this moisture just surging up from the Gulf. Again, some of that extra moisture is being brought into the Gulf by that tropical disturbance. So all that moisture is available, and these low level winds are just bringing it right up into the Midwest. And you can see these values just skyrocketing. This is by 7 p.m. on Wednesday, when a lot of these storms are going to be ongoing. These purple areas here, you're going to have all sorts of moisture available to these storms at the surface. And you can see these winds in general are kind of coming up this direction at the surface, just continuing to bring that moisture up even during this event. Now taking a look at our cloud cover, again, we need clouds to break up in order to get atmospheric recovery from the sun hitting the ground and kind of breaking things up a little bit and reestablishing the atmosphere if we want tornadoes. Obviously, we don't, which means we want clouds. But unfortunately, as we go through the day on Wednesday, you can see, especially in Missouri and Illinois, a lot of these clouds are going to be kind of non-existent throughout the day. And right before, during kind of some of the peak heating hours here in the afternoon on Wednesday, these clouds are going to really break up and allow for some of that atmospheric recovery. So again, the setup is just very, very concerning. Taking a look at our storm motion vector to see what direction these storms will be moving in. On Wednesday, this is at 7 p.m., kind of in the midst of everything here. You can see these vectors are kind of coming towards the east and maybe slightly towards the south or northeast, depending on where you're at. And that is honestly a good thing for storms, a bad thing for people, as the forcing mechanism is kind of along this type of axis here that I've drawn in white. So the more perpendicular you get to that axis, the more favorable you are for discrete storms, isolated storms that are going to be able to be significant producers of possibly longer track tornadoes and being able to take advantage of that environment. Again, you can see this storm motion vector allowing storms to stay sort of semi-discrete. So I'll draw it out for you. So along this line of thunderstorms, if you have a storm motion vector that's moving kind of parallel to your forcing mechanism, as you can see that white line and that arrow, those are kind of parallel to each other. What happens is all these storms start to combine and form a line very, very quickly. But when you have a storm motion vector that's more of like what we have in this scenario, these storms don't interact with each other as soon or as often and are able to stay discrete. And when you have those discrete supercells ingesting that insane environment ahead of them, a lot of the times that's where you're going to get those longer track tornadoes and some of those stronger supercells that are able to form ahead of that forcing mechanism. Taking a look at our CAPE, this is just a measure of how much energy there is for rising motion and thunderstorms to develop. By 7 p.m., you can see these values are not anything absolutely enormous throughout this region. However, the forcing mechanism is going to act as a wedge. Basically, that cold air is going to wedge underneath warmer air and force it up into the atmosphere. And so we're still going to get storms. And the fact that we have lower amounts of CAPE and instability is almost a bad thing for residents in this area. As if you had too much instability, you would have all sorts of storms firing off, and they would kind of congeal and become a mess or a line of thunderstorms where the tornado risk at that point would lower. But when you have a little bit less instability, the forcing is kind of the main factor in play here. So again, you're able to get those isolated thunderstorms that are able to kind of stay discrete and stay by themselves, just absorbing that environment without any interference. Looking at our SIN, this is just the opposite of instability, where areas where rising motion is not supported, and in fact, it's inhibited. And as we go into the evening hours on Wednesday, you can see there is actually some SIN in place. And again, a lot of times that might be a good thing, as it might stop storms from firing off. But in this case, we're going to have storms firing off regardless. So the question is, can they remain discrete? And when you have SIN like this, it's going to actually help them remain discrete, because it's going to limit exactly how many storms fire off. I did want to quickly play through the total QPF. So this is just how much precipitation is going to fall over the next 48 hours, essentially. You can see these numbers in the southeast just beginning to build like crazy as we're getting into the afternoon on Wednesday here. And eventually we're about to get to the end of this forecast period through the early morning hours on Thursday. So this is by 6 a.m. on Thursday. You can see a lot of rainfall in the Midwest. So the potential for some flooding. Look at Chicago up near 4 inches, Detroit over 4 inches modeled here. But in the southeast, again, we're having this major risk for some flooding going on with this tropical disturbance that's coming out of the Gulf of Mexico and into kind of the Texas area and even Louisiana and Mississippi. So you can see all this rainfall that's falling along the coast. So again, if you're in those areas, I know a lot of the emphasis is going to be on the tornado outlook for the central United States, and not much attention is going to be given to the coast. But you need to make sure that you're staying aware of the potential flash flooding risk along the Gulf Coast if you're in that area, as it could be very, very concerning for you as well. And that's going to bring us to the end of today's forecast. Make sure that you're following us on all platforms so that you can stay weather aware. We're not going to be broadcasting tomorrow night, as we will be out there storm chasing with quite a few storm chasers. But for Thursday's severe weather setup, I most likely will be broadcasting. So make sure that you have notifications turned on for that. And make sure you have notifications turned on for videos so that you know when our next forecast drops tomorrow morning, as tomorrow is looking to be a very significant potential outbreak for severe weather in portions of the Midwest. So again, thank you for watching. Thank you for trusting Will Bratton WX as your source for trusted weather information, and I will see you soon.